Some people spend most of their lives trying to be easy to love. They become experts at keeping everyone comfortable. They avoid conflict before it even begins. They apologize quickly, even when they did nothing wrong. They stay quiet during arguments because tension feels emotionally dangerous. At first, the world rewards this behavior. Teachers call them mature. Coworkers call them easy to work with. Friends describe them as supportive. Relationships seem peaceful because they rarely challenge anyone directly. But underneath that peaceful image, something painful often begins growing quietly. Resentment. Because many people are not truly kind. They are afraid. Afraid of rejection. Afraid of criticism. Afraid of disappointing people. Afraid of becoming difficult to love. And, over time, constantly abandoning yourself for other people slowly destroys your relationship with yourself. That is why some of the nicest people secretly feel emotionally exhausted. They spend years making everyone else comfortable while quietly becoming strangers to themselves. A person agrees to extra responsibilities at work they never wanted. A friend listens to everyone else's problems while nobody notices they are struggling too. Someone stays in relationships where they constantly suppress their feelings because conflict feels terrifying. Eventually, emotional suppression begins creating psychological pressure. And the dangerous part is that most people mistake this suppression for maturity. But suppression and peace are not the same thing. Real peace feels grounded. Suppression feels tense. One comes from emotional strength. The other comes from fear. And fear changes people slowly. At first, weakness looks harmless. But weakness that lasts too long often turns into bitterness. Every human being has darkness inside them. Jealousy, anger, aggression, selfishness, the desire to hurt people who hurt them. Most people do not like admitting this. They prefer believing they are completely good people. But emotions that are denied do not disappear. They hide. Carl Jung described this hidden psychological world as the shadow. The shadow is made of the parts of ourselves we reject because they conflict with the image we want to believe about who we are. A person might believe they are emotionally calm while secretly filled with resentment. Someone might claim to hate drama while constantly creating emotional tension indirectly. A person may appear polite in public while exploding with rage at home over small frustrations. That is the strange thing about suppressed emotions. The more aggressively people deny them, the more power they gain underneath the surface. Because what remains unconscious eventually controls behavior. Many people spend years smiling at coworkers they secretly dislike. They congratulate friends while privately comparing themselves to them. They say, "I'm fine," while emotionally drowning inside. And slowly, their inner world becomes divided. Externally, they appear controlled. Internally, they feel exhausted. That internal division creates enormous psychological tension over time. And eventually, something inside people begins demanding honesty. Because human beings cannot suppress themselves forever without consequences. People rarely become emotionally unstable overnight. Usually, bitterness builds slowly over years. Someone spends years tolerating disrespect at work, years staying silent during unhealthy relationships, years pretending criticism or humiliation does not hurt them emotionally. At first, they tell themselves they are being mature, but internally, pressure keeps building. Humiliation slowly becomes resentment. Resentment slowly becomes hostility. Hostility slowly becomes emotional exhaustion. There are employees quietly mocked in offices for years, until one day they suddenly quit without warning. There are people who spend most of their lives trying desperately to please everyone before emotionally cutting people off completely. There are individuals who suppress pain for so long that anger eventually becomes their entire personality. Most emotional breakdowns are not random. They are years of silent frustration finally reaching psychological capacity. And strangely, society often misunderstands these moments completely. People see the explosion, but they never notice the years of emotional pressure that created it. Weakness often looks peaceful in the beginning, but weakness creates helplessness. Helplessness creates frustration. And frustration eventually becomes dangerous when people feel psychologically trapped. That is why emotional honesty matters. Not because anger is beautiful, but because denied anger becomes distorted anger. And distorted emotions eventually control behavior in destructive ways. One of the strangest truths about psychology is that emotionally strong people usually appear calmer than emotionally fragile people. People often assume confidence creates arrogance, but real confidence usually creates stability instead. The person constantly trying to dominate conversations is often deeply insecure internally. The person reacting aggressively to every disagreement is usually protecting a fragile ego. The person obsessed with proving their intelligence or superiority often feels psychologically threatened underneath the performance. Real strength behaves differently. It feels grounded. That is partly why disciplined fighters are often calmer during conflict than ordinary people. Not because they enjoy violence, because they no longer feel helpless. Someone capable of defending themselves often feels less desperate to prove anything socially. They do not constantly seek validation because their sense of self feels more stable internally. This is why characters like Entity, Batman resonate so deeply with audiences. Not because he is violent, because he represents controlled darkness. The same is true for Entity John Wick. People are not fascinated by these characters because they are cruel. They are fascinated because these characters possess enormous destructive capability while remaining governed by discipline. Controlled strength feels safer than fragile niceness, pretending to be morality. That does not mean people should become cruel. It means emotional strength creates peace more effectively than emotional helplessness. And there is a massive psychological difference between the two. Life begins changing when people stop betraying themselves to keep everyone comfortable. Usually the changes begin small. Someone says no without apologizing afterward. Someone expresses disagreement honestly for the first time in years. Someone stops accepting unfair treatment at work. Someone leaves relationships where they constantly feel emotionally invisible. And strangely, the world often responds differently almost immediately, because people unconsciously recognize boundaries. Manipulative individuals naturally move toward people who seem psychologically weak, but emotionally grounded people often discourage manipulation without needing to become aggressive. Healthy boundaries are not cruelty, they are self-respect. Many people spend years believing they are maintaining peace when they are actually maintaining emotional imbalance. They suppress frustration to avoid conflict. They abandon their needs to avoid rejection. They tolerate disrespect because confrontation feels emotionally dangerous. Eventually, that imbalance leaks out through passive aggression, bitterness, emotional withdrawal, or sudden hostility. That is why boundaries matter psychologically. Not because healthy people enjoy conflict, because honest boundaries prevent resentment from growing silently underneath relationships. And one of the most life-changing realizations a person can have is understanding this. Boundaries do not destroy healthy relationships. They expose unhealthy ones. Modern culture constantly teaches people to chase comfort, entertainment, pleasure, ease, distraction, but psychologically, comfort alone rarely fulfills human beings for very long. In fact, endless comfort often creates emptiness surprisingly quickly. People need meaning, and meaning usually emerges through responsibility. That is why exhausted parents continue working hard for their children even when life becomes difficult. That is why some people survive depression after finding someone or something they genuinely want to protect. Responsibility creates structure. Discipline creates identity. Commitment creates purpose. Human beings can tolerate enormous suffering when their pain serves something meaningful, but meaninglessness destroys people frighteningly fast. Many emotionally lost individuals are not suffering because life is too difficult. They are suffering because nothing in their life feels important enough to justify the difficulty. Without meaning, people drift psychologically, and that drift eventually becomes despair. This is why many people feel emotionally empty despite living comfortable lives. They consume endless entertainment, scroll constantly, distract themselves endlessly. But distraction is not fulfillment, and eventually silence catches up to them. Because deep down, human beings want to feel useful. They want their existence to matter, and responsibility often becomes the thing that finally grounds people psychologically. Most people want to believe cruel individuals are fundamentally different from ordinary people. History suggests otherwise. Under the right conditions, normal human beings can become surprisingly destructive. The Stanford prison experiment revealed how quickly ordinary people adapted to power and cruelty. Online mob behavior demonstrates similar patterns constantly. Entire groups of strangers can destroy someone emotionally simply because cruelty becomes socially rewarding inside crowds. That is the unsettling part about human psychology. Not that evil exists, but that ordinary people are capable of participating in it far more easily than they want to believe. And ironically, people who insist they are incapable of darkness are often the least prepared to control it, because self-awareness creates caution. A person who understands their own jealousy becomes more careful with envy. A person who understands their anger becomes less likely to explode unconsciously. A person who recognizes their selfishness becomes more responsible with power. But someone convinced they are purely good often trusts themselves too easily. That is why understanding the shadow matters psychologically. Not because human beings should become darker, but because unconscious darkness becomes dangerous darkness. And ignored emotions rarely remain harmless forever. Real self-development is uncomfortable. People love motivational ideas until growth requires painful honesty about themselves. Their insecurity, their ego, their fear of rejection, their emotional dependency, their resentment. Most people spend enormous energy avoiding self-awareness because truth feels humiliating at first. It hurts realizing certain forms of kindness came from fear instead of strength. It hurts recognizing how much validation controlled self-worth. It hurts understanding that suppressed emotions quietly shaped behavior for years. But avoiding those truths only strengthens emotional fragility over time. That is why people who constantly run from discomfort often remain trapped in the same psychological patterns for decades. They blame relationships, jobs, society, other people, but they never fully confront themselves honestly. Yet, the moment someone stops running from their own psychology, real transformation begins. Because self-awareness feels painful before it feels liberating. And maturity begins the moment people become capable of facing themselves truthfully, not perfectly. Honestly, many people confuse weakness with peace, but psychologically, they are completely different states. Weakness says, I cannot fight back. Peace says, I could, but I choose control. That difference matters enormously. A calm person with strong boundaries creates emotional stability. A helpless person pretending to be calm usually creates hidden resentment underneath the surface. Real peace requires capability. That is why emotionally secure people rarely feel the need to dominate conversations, scream during arguments, or constantly prove themselves socially. Their calmness comes from internal stability instead of helplessness. Controlled power creates genuine peace. Helplessness creates fear disguised as politeness, and fear changes people psychologically over time because human beings cannot abandon themselves forever without consequences. Eventually, something inside them begins demanding honesty, and that moment changes everything. The goal of maturity is not becoming emotionless, and it is not becoming cruel. The real goal is becoming emotionally strong enough that fear no longer controls your life. That transformation happens when people stop denying their darker emotions and start understanding them honestly, because acknowledged anger is safer than suppressed anger. Acknowledged insecurity is healthier than hidden insecurity. Acknowledged weakness can improve. Denied weakness usually controls people unconsciously forever. Over time, emotionally strong people stop needing constant approval from everyone around them. They stop collapsing during conflict. They stop abandoning themselves just to keep others comfortable. And strangely, the more honest people become about themselves internally, the calmer they often become externally. Because real self-control only becomes possible after self-awareness. People who understand their emotions are less controlled by them. People who understand their shadow are less likely to project it onto others. People who accept their capacity for darkness often become more careful with power. That is the paradox most people never fully understand. Self-awareness does not make people more dangerous, it makes them safer, because unconscious weakness creates instability. Unconscious resentment creates manipulation. Unconscious pain spreads into relationships, workplaces, families, and entire communities. But people who confront themselves honestly develop something different: resilience, emotional control, self-respect, and eventually, their kindness becomes genuine. Not kindness created by fear, but kindness supported by honesty, strength, boundaries, and emotional stability. That is the difference between weakness and real inner peace. And understanding that difference changes people permanently.